Hello, I'm Maya Nouns, Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defense Policy at the IISS and host of the Sound Strategic podcast. In today's episode, we'll discuss Australia's relationship with China and how AUKUS, the trilateral security pact between Australia, the UK, and the US, plays a role in Australia's defense and alliance policy settings. We'll discuss the changes over time in Australia's policy towards China following a souring of bilateral relations in recent years, and touch on potential lessons for other countries of how to respond to economic and diplomatic coercive policies. We'll talk about what Australia got right, but also what it potentially got wrong, and discuss whether there is any sign of significant change in the China-Australia bilateral relationship under the new Labour government in Canberra. 2 years since the announcement of AUKUS, the leaders of Australia, the UK, and the US have unveiled details of their four-phase plan to create a new fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. So what does AUKUS aim to achieve in the short and medium term? What elements will be critical to its success or failure? And what prospect might there be of broadening the pact to include other partners? Joining me in my discussion today are Dr. Ewan Graham, IISS Shangri-La Senior Fellow for Indo-Pacific Defense and Strategy, and author of the recently published IISS Adelphi book on Australia's China policy, titled Australia's Security in China's Shadow, and Nick Childs, IISS Senior Fellow for Maritime Security and Naval Forces in the IISS's Defense and Military Analysis Program. Ewan and Nick, welcome onto the show. Ewan, why should we be interested in the Australia-China security dynamic? What are the takeaways for an international audience?
Thanks, Mayor. It's been a very roustabout period in Australia-China relations. Australia is a long way from China and normally wouldn't expect this level of attention. Over the last 2 or 3 years, things have really crystallized, I think, in a way that was helpful for the conclusions of my book, which focuses on the security dynamics of the Australia-China relationship. My premise is that this is not a myopic view of a bilateral relationship. This is something that is useful to a broader audience. And I think that the issues that Australia has been dealing with, in some senses, are ahead of the game. We could point to the decision to exclude Chinese participants in the 5G communications decision back in 2018, AUKUS on the defense and hard power side, and legislation against foreign interference on the domestic national security front. I think Australia is not a perfect paradigm. Like any democracy, it's imperfect, and its process of learning has been rather messy with China. And there's a lot of baggage and history in there, which readers of the book can hopefully unpack. There are learning points, albeit not perfect paradigm, for all countries, especially democracies, and especially federal democracies, because I think that there are some particular parallels there.
Now, you frame Australia's comprehensive policy responses mainly in positive terms. You've just said that Australia has been ahead of the game on a number of issues. What has Australia got wrong in dealing with China?
The honest answer to that is that Australia has struggled to deal with a relationship that had seemed extremely positive, particularly in the economic domain, for so long. And so much of the Australian public and elite, the business elite, and also the policy elite were invested in a positive relationship for Australia in the China relationship. That sort of became conflated with a longer theme in Australian foreign policy, which is whether Australia, geographically removed from the United States and the UK, could find its identity long-term in Asia. China is not Asia, and those two things, I think, for my money, became conflated during the period of maximum economic complementarity between the two countries. So I think there was naivety is a strong word, but there were certainly elements of that in the Australian approach towards China. And economically, it has been an extraordinarily good news story. Most countries find that they are trading more with China, but Australia much more than most, up to about 40% of its trade in goods and services in 2021. So that's a very significant take. And obviously the economics has undergirded that positive view. And then very rapidly, I think China overreached and tried to use that economic leverage to try and maneuver Australia into a more palatable political position. I don't think China was ever trying to convert Australia to its side, but it maybe saw a position of potential neutrality that it could aim for. The learning process is far from over. It's always ongoing, and I think that's true for other countries. There are no set lessons from this. It's an evolving challenge. Australia will evolve in its approach too.
Can I just dig into the economic coercion question a little bit? Because that's something that a lot of other countries are paying attention to at the moment. It's also an area where a lot of people are trying to actually look for data to see how China exerts economic coercion, who it seeks to target, what it seeks to leverage, and whether or not it's been successful in the long term. I wonder how you might encapsulate or summarize China's attempt to economically coerce Australia into that neutral position you refer to. Did we see trade suffer? Did it have an impact on Australian businesses?
It certainly did. This was in the peak of COVID, so it was through that particularly distorting lens that we all lived through. And I think that perhaps contributed something to it. China has periodically hinted at the economic lever against things that it doesn't like that Australia does in the political and security space. And around 2017, in my book, I underlined that was really the watershed when domestic legislation was rolled out by the Turnbull administration. But before that, we also had Australia taking a fairly robust position on the South China Sea and East China Sea. China was angered by that, periodically would delay shipments, things that had a plausible deniability or some element of deniability. That all changed in 2021 after Australia made the call, for an inquiry into the outbreak of the COVID pandemic and China's handling of it. Then China signaled that it was unhappy with that and that there would be consequences. And those consequences came in the form of formal and informal sanctions against trade sectors in Australia, largely in the agricultural space, wine, lobsters, barley, but also coal. The interesting standout from that was iron ore, and that shows, I think, a revealing pattern that China had picked the fight with the wrong country because although Australia is much smaller, it enjoys a global market leader status in that key commodity which China needs. Overall, there was no macroeconomic damage. There was very significant sectoral damage to those agricultural exports that were targeted by China. But I think the key takeaway from the Australian experience is hold your nerve, diversify your market, and wait for the market to adjust. And I think that it validated that in the Australian case, despite that preponderant leading trade partner status that China has.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite statistics that came out of the economic coercion piece in the last few years has been that exports of rock lobsters, which you referred to China, were indeed restricted, but instead Australian rock lobster exports to Hong Kong increased to something like 2,000%. And so even I think in terms of loopholes in China of how to gain access to restricted Australian goods clearly showed in the statistics. Now, in terms of that bilateral relationship, it appears that bilateral relations have recovered since the new Labour government came to power in Australia last year. Is that really the case? Has China changed its tune after a long period of tensions?
The new Labour government, which came in May of last year, has been careful in framing how it wants to improve the relationship. There's been no talk about resetting the relationship, which I think has been disproven because previous Australian administrations and other countries which have tried to do the same have failed to reset. I think it's fundamentally a flawed paradigm in how to handle the China relationship, because if you put the relationship front and center, then actually that plays to China's handling of that. That the relationship itself becomes a sine qua non in a way that it shouldn't be. It should be framed around national interests instead. So the current formulation is that Australia wants to stabilize the relationship. And interestingly, China has just very recently, in the form of an opinion editorial by its ambassador in Canberra, used that language. So for the moment, we do see a calming of tensions and a willingness to engage, including in the defence space, which is interesting. There have been no defence talks bilaterally since 2019. We found out those have happened. albeit in a low-key fashion. And I think that shows that rather than Australia having to mend its ways, it shows that I think China has found out that using the economic coercion tool is much harder when you in practice than the threat of it and the psychological effect of the threat, because Australia actually found out that diversification was easier than it had thought, and many in the business community didn't think so. But that experiment had to be run, and now I think China is adjusting from a weaker position. That would be my read. I think the important longer term judgment from that is that there is no fundamental change in the relationship between China and Australia. There is a wariness on the Australian side. Things will not go back to the good old days of 2001 to 2013. It's a very much more guarded mentality on the Australian side. But economic engagement will continue, and that's the needle that Australia has to thread.
So, where does AUKUS fit into your defense and alliance chapter? Can Australia really hope to deter China in a military sense?
Well, one thing I'd like to stress for an international audience, it's sometimes forgotten that AUKUS, although it's very much a three-way partnership that has gone very far in a fairly short time, it originated from Australia. So this was not something that was imposed on Australia by the United States or the United Kingdom. The agency was very much with the smallest partner within the three. In my book, I take a comprehensive view of Chinese security challenge, including domestic, national security, counter-interference legislation, the political economy of the relationship. But defense and security is an important part of the external strategic policy that Australia is adjusting to. I don't think AUKUS is the inflection point. The inflection point was the Defence Strategic Review that Australia handed down in 2020. AUKUS is an intensification and a follow through from that logic, which is that Australia needs to have a heftier punch in order to be part of a deterrent framework in which the United States is clearly front and center. The alliance remains the bedrock of Australian security. It would be extremely expensive and hard, if not impossible, for Australia to defend its interests alone. So I think it's a doubling down on the alliance, but consciously on Australia's part, very interestingly, given all of the political difficulties around the time when it was brokered in the Trump administration, it was a clear bet that the alliance was the best option for Australia, and in particular, the nuclear submarine element of that.
Maybe for our listeners who don't know what AUKUS is, Nick, turning to you, what exactly is AUKUS and what will it mean that Australia will end up operating a fleet of nuclear powered submarines, particularly in terms of regional naval competition that Ewan just highlighted too?
Thanks, Mayor. Well, at heart, AUKUS is pretty monumental, actually. Plan by the three partners to deliver to Australia a nuclear-powered but conventionally armed attack submarine capability. Even in terms of that kind of technical challenge and capability challenge, there are other elements to it as well in terms of further cooperation on advanced capabilities, including undersea, but others as well, hypersonics and counter-hypersonics, artificial intelligence, autonomy, a broader range of capability ambitions. To some extent, more than that, there's a debate over whether it is just a technical capability cooperation agreement or whether it is a stronger alliance construct. And as Ewan hinted, it's actually both, and that kind of dual identity is part of the issues around what it is and what it means, particularly in the region. In terms of the capability on the submarine front, as Ewan absolutely pointed out, this was an initiative out of Canberra, essentially because as part of their review, they saw not only was the future arriving earlier than they were expecting in some ways in terms of the security challenge, but it was getting darker, and what they had in place, they decided was not going to be fit for purpose. So it will mean a significant step change for the Australian Navy in particular, a huge change for the Australian Navy, and it will change the Australian Navy too. And because of the scale of what's being undertaken, it'll also, I think, change the balance of capabilities within the whole Australian defence establishment. Therefore, the position perhaps of the maritime in that context, what it will deliver is absolutely a more potent and survivable long-range strike capability, which in the context both of the alliance and more broadly will inject a significant capability into the naval domain, and therefore will provide, I think, some pause for thought in Beijing as well as it calculates its trajectory going forward. Beyond the alliance, the other sort of change, I suppose, in terms of calculations is that it does provide some kind of at least operationally independent capability to deploy forward at a certain level as well. So that adds to the strategic mixes.
Now, in terms of the submarine plan that you mentioned, this is obviously very complex. Why has it been put together in this way, and what are the risks?
It is complex, and I think that underscores that it is going to be a challenge for all the partners, and there was never an easy way of delivering on that ultimate capability for the Australians. Part of the reason it's been put together in this way is an indigenous capability for Australia in the submarine space was never going to be quick either. At best, we're talking about the very late 2030s or into the 2040s before Australia will get its first nuclear-powered submarine of its own making, as it were. In order to help Australia with that process, but also actually to deliver strategic effect earlier than the 2040s, and to help Australia get over, if you like, the trough that would take place with the aging of the current submarines and their falling off in operational capability and the arrival of the first submarine. We have this phased approach, which will be, first of all, there's already cross-fertilization and embedding of Australian personnel, both civilian and uniformed, into both the industrial bases of the UK and the US, but also into the nuclear submarine training programs. There'll be early visits that will help lift Australia's capability by US and UK submarines, and then the forward deployment of US and UK submarines, another step for Australian capability enhancement, but also raising that sort of strategic effect capability earlier on. The introduction of US Virginia-class submarines that will be bought by the Australians in the early 2030s, another step change for Australia in terms of moving towards the ultimate goal. And then in the early 2040s, the first arrival of the first Australian indigenous nuclear-powered submarine. So that's the kind of incremental approach that will provide rising capability, but it's not going to be easy putting all those moving parts together. It'd be true to say that both the UK and the US are not in the best place themselves at the moment in terms of their industrial capacity, even for delivering their own demands. There will need to be investment, including some down payments by the Australians into the US and UK industrial bases to help lift them as well. There will be a huge requirement, and this is one of the keys, I think, to lift the skills base and the workforce of all three countries in order to deliver an expanded capability. So all of those things represent enormous kind of risk factors in all of this, but the potential benefits, I think, strategically and industrially and just in terms of operational capability for all three are also potentially significant.
So you've just mentioned the need for industrial capacity in each of these three countries, but given the level of ambition, it obviously also requires a very long-term commitment by all three partners if the first delivery is going to be into the 2040s. So what will it mean for their strategic partnership in the long run, and what will be the critical elements to success or failure of the program?
I think going back to the point about the kind of dual identity of AUKUS in the first place, it does bind that kind of strategic alliance together, certainly as far as Australia and the US are concerned. But it also, if you like, cements in a UK capability and participation into the Indo-Pacific kind of strategic dynamic. There's much debate in the UK about the much heralded Indo-Pacific tilt and what it really amounts to in terms of capability, and whether indeed the kind of commitments that are implied are wise when the Euro-Atlantic is a hotbed of strategic uncertainty and concern at the moment, and is the declared priority. And it's interesting that as part of AUKUS, there will be later this decade the commitment of a forward deployed UK submarine into Australia and into the mix. And that is a not inconsiderable extra commitment in the Indo-Pacific tilt context by the UK, which will be challenging as well. So all those elements together. In terms of the critical elements to it, the requirement for all the countries concerned to sustain that bipartisan political support going forward. This is certainly a national endeavour of considerable proportions for Australia, but it's also not an insignificant requirement for the others as well. The other, I suppose, critical inflection point is this question of being able to deliver the required scale of technically able workforce. And it's not just the nuclear construction requirements, but also the nuclear operators of the submarines at all levels, really, from top to bottom. And the management of that whole process will be a significant strain on the whole endeavour, I think.
So what next for AUKUS? Because it's more, as you said, than just about building submarines. What about the second pillar of technical cooperation and the prospects that it might be broadened out to include other partners?
That is an interesting question going forward. And again, it goes back to what AUKUS actually is. One has got the impression, even in the last 18 months, that there have been slightly different kind of priorities and ambitions, even amongst the partners, on what AUKUS should turn into, with the US perhaps seeing it as more a kind of building block for strategic relationships that could potentially be opened up. For Canberra, for Australia, I think absolutely the critical element to all of this was they needed to get the submarine pillar in place before thinking about anything else beyond that. Keeping that core partnership that can deliver that was absolutely key, in focusing on that. Now that the plan has been put in place and will move forward, albeit with challenges, I think that does shift the focus a little bit more to the second pillar, those in advanced capabilities that will also in some ways be key to the submarine pillar also being effective in the longer term. There may be questions around what resources are left amongst the three partners, frankly, and particularly in Australia, given the scale just in financial terms of what's being undertaken, whether that might crowd out some of the other capability ambitions that are there. But what it probably also does is potentially open the aperture, maybe not immediately, but over the coming years, to look at whether our AUKUS, at least in that second pillar, might be expanded somewhat to bring in others. I mean, people jokingly talk, for example, of AUKUS becoming JAUKUS because of the potential that Japan, which is also interested in and pursuing and can deliver certain capabilities into some of these areas, not least hypersonics, counter hypersonics, some of those advanced capabilities, might be an additional partner in that space going forward. So that will perhaps change the dynamics of AUKUS going forward as well. But that's a work in progress. It's something that many others around the region and beyond are looking at and wondering about the potential there for further cooperation and an increase in the club membership, as it were, as far as AUKUS is concerned.
Maybe just to end on one question for both of you. It seems like there's been a lot of activity in the last, certainly 2 years since the start of COVID-19 with regards to China, not just, of course, in economic terms, responding to China's economic coercion, thinking about economic security, and in military terms, thinking about these mini-laterals to build capability into the future, thinking about the submarine program, thinking about how far we still have yet to go in terms of this second pillar of technical cooperation in AUKUS. Is this all a little bit too little too late? Or do you think both of these efforts are going to have an impact on regional security in Australia and in the West's favor?
I think the fact that the submarine decision was rolled out in the phased way that it was a hint that on three sides there was a recognition that 2040 just didn't cut it somehow, given the potential for the threat to come much sooner than that. And I think the forward basing aspects really do deserve attention, because this is not just a kind of commercial capability development program. There is significantly more to it. And I think that goes a fair way to answering the question about, is there a capability gap, which was going to be the main line, I think, of criticism of AUKUS if it had only focused on the future submarine that was going to be delivered, not this decade or even the next decade, but from the 2040s. I think Ukraine has also maybe focused minds. The decision to jointly invest in industrial capability, I've been thinking about this, although the decision was made not in a Ukraine context, it means more post-Ukraine, because this is a demonstration that conflict is not necessarily over in a tidy matter of weeks or months. It may go on for some time, and the capability which you enter the war is not the deciding factor. It's much more likely to be the industrial and technological capacity to sustain over that conflict. So I think AUKUS is a sort of a bet in the right direction from that point of view. It's much more meaningful than just dealing with submarines on its own. I think play the counterfactual to this. Where would we be had AUKUS not happened? Well, the French conventional submarine program, which was budgeted to be about Australia 200 billion, which is, it's not hugely different from the 268 to 368 billion, which AUKUS has been estimated. If that had been allowed, I think, to go on as it was, with Australia clearly dissatisfied, France in a state perhaps of benign ignorance to that, I don't think it would have been a satisfactory state of affairs. So there's been, I think, a lot of attention to the diplomatic downsides, particularly with the French relationship and in the region of AUKUS. But it shows that this is fundamentally a kind of gripping of the problem. To your question, is it too little too late? Well, we won't know. Proving negatives is a perpetual problem of strategic studies and deterrence. But it's a pretty big investment in that direction. However, and there is a however, it's not a silver bullet capability. We have another big shoe to drop next month with the Australian Defence Strategic Review, and that will have to cope with the budgetary implications of so much investment going into a single capability and a single service. But any conflict or contingency that is likely to come Australia's way within the next 15 years is clearly going to require more than just a nuclear submarine or any kind of standalone capability. It's going to require something maybe that gets to the weak point, which is Australia is a technologically capable force, but with 60,000 thereabout uniformed personnel, it's very, very small, often described as a rather dismissively as a boutique force. In Australia, the main line of critique about AUKUS is often on sovereignty, that there is a perceived diminution of Australian sovereignty, despite the fact that Canberra initiated the deal. In industrial development terms, I think that actually is likely to work the other way around, because the track record shows that when Australia has done this alone with defence mega projects, it's flopped. It's been over budget and delayed. The thing about AUKUS, although it's a trilateral partnership, it's not clearly a trilateral partnership of equals in scale terms. And ultimately, if there are delays on the Australian or UK side, it comes to the United States really to lean in. And although this may look like a very good deal for the United States now, in terms of the forward basing access that it's been given and the sale of Virginias and the adjunct that implies to the US Navy, I think the guarantor of last resort to AUKUS is going to be the United States. So there is risk on Washington's side too.
I'd pretty much endorse what Ewan said in terms of the broad thrust. And there is always a tension between strategic ambition and delivering on a significant step change in capability, which nuclear-powered submarines for Australia it was never going to be delivered quickly in that respect, and the concern about urgent requirements. And that dilemma, if you like, has been sharpened both by Ukraine, but also by concern about the darkening of the strategic picture in the Indo-Pacific as well. So that's why that phased incremental approach, even on the submarines, is key to injecting additional capability as time goes by. AUKUS and the submarines and even bits of AUKUS are not exclusive to other developments that are going on, even in Australia. Ewan said, let's see what the Defence Strategic Review actually prioritises, but there are other capability enhancements that will come in, for example, the land attack cruise missiles and the other missile capabilities. And I would imagine the priority will be on those that can be delivered in a timely fashion. Likewise, on AUKUS, on the advanced capabilities, which of those are prioritised, I think will depend to some extent on which can deliver effect sooner. Interestingly, that was a point that Admiral Aquilino made in his special lecture address the other day for the IISS, when he was asked, what about the Pillar 2 AUKUS, and he emphasised that, as far as he was concerned, delivering capability enhancements quickly was a priority. So I think that will be the case going forward. AUKUS fits into a whole range of other activities that are going on, particularly in the naval space, in which Australia is participating, of step changes, I think, in the interactions, interoperability, interplay that is going on between naval forces and in exercises. So a whole range of other things are underway, which I would contend are actually, to some extent, already beginning. If the concern about the naval balance shifting too far too quickly towards China in a concerning way is still very much there, there may be the first hints in all of these things coming together of, if you like, the pendulum at least slowing down to some extent, and maybe a bit of a swing back towards enhanced capabilities on the part of the US and its partners. So I think all of those things coming together need to be looked at in the round, as well as clearly the AUKUS element to it, which perhaps in naval terms is the most profound and significant as a single initiative, and certainly the one that's attracted attention. But it's all part of a bigger piece.
Well, that's all we have time for today, unfortunately, so thank you, Ewan and Nick, for sharing your insights. And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. For more in-depth analysis, visit the IISS's website and follow the IISS on Twitter and LinkedIn. You'll find more information in our show notes, including a link to Ewan's new book, Australia's Security in China's Shadow. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. Thank you and see you next time.